Hello friends, and welcome to another video. This is the first of a new video series I plan to release, called Fabrics and Fundamentals. This video series aims to take a lot of the sewing terminology and techniques and break them down into easily digestible videos for sewers of all levels to be able to enjoy, from beginner to advanced. So I'm sure you're keen to get learning. Well, let's begin. Today's subject is fabric grain. First and foremost, what is grain? According to Wikipedia, for woven textiles, grain refers to the orientation of the weft and warp threads. Okay, let's translate that into normal English. All fabric is made up of two different types of threads woven together to create the cloth. The threads going across the fabric horizontally are called the cross grain, horizontal grain, or the weft. The threads going up and down the fabric vertically are called the length grain or straight grain, also called the warp. I made a simple illustration to make these terms even easier to remember. When you say weft, your mouth widens horizontally, and when you say warp, it lengthens vertically. An easy way to remember which is to look for the selvage. Selvedge is the name for the self-finished edge of the fabric, which doesn't fray, and they run parallel all the way down the bolt of the fabric. The selvedge is always the vertical length of the cloth, which means it's the longest part and therefore is always the length grain or the warp. When thinking of selvedge, imagine a long bolt of fabric all rolled up. The sides or the edges are the self-edge. The short width is the horizontal weft and the long length is the vertical warp. Now, just to confuse you, in addition to having the cross grain and the length grain, you also have the bias grain. But what is bias? Bias grain is at a 45-degree angle from the length grain. Does that name sound familiar? Yep, that's because bias tape is made from the bias grain of fabric. So what is the difference between all these grains? Well, let's say you're cutting out a pattern. It's always important to cut the fabric properly on the grain, and here's why. Let's first talk about fabric behavior and movement. Let's show the importance of grain in terms of how fabric moves. For this experiment, I've cut out a square of fabric of equal width and length from just regular cotton drill. Now let's see what happens when we try to stretch it. Pulling it on the grain seems to have no effect. Let's turn it around and pulling it on the other grain. Yep, it's still staying the same. Now trying to pull it on the bias, and as you can see, it's got quite a lot of stretch. When you cut fabric on a bias, you're cutting at an angle from the threads of the cloth. That means that instead of having the secure anchor of the vertical and the horizontal weave, you have an unsteady weave instead. Bias is the loosest grain, which means it has the most stretch. Which is great if you have a looser weave, like silk or satin, that you want to drape over a body. For example, let's look at a bias cut dress. While much harder to work with because you need more experience manipulating fabric, a bias cut dress naturally falls to the body's curves and is much more organic. Fabric cut on the grain will still drape, but the flex and shape of it is less natural and more structured. Bias binding and bias tape are very useful because not only can you finish edges beautifully with them, but because the weave is looser, you can steam it down into place without wrinkles, unlike tape cut on the grain. Here's what a curved edge looks like bound in bias binding, as opposed to an edge bound in ribbon cut on a straight grain. Do you see how much flatter, smooth, and less wrinkly it's turned out?
Boo! Get off the stage!
Let's talk about some difficulties one might encounter while trying to use fabric. Maybe you were gifted some fabric or found an amazing offcut from a store, but it was cut like a Tetris block, so you have no idea where the grain is. You've looked and you cannot find the selvage anywhere. Your fabric has a pattern that should be straight, like stripes, but instead of the pattern being woven in, it was printed on, and the print is not exactly straight. Here are a couple of tips to help you out. Tip number 1. In some fabrics, it's easy to find the grain just by looking at the pattern on the cloth. Gingham, for example, is woven using different coloured threads, so you can tell the warp and the weft apart easily just by following the naturally occurring pattern. When it comes to printed fabric, however, you have to be more careful because sometimes the pattern is printed off grain or crookedly. Tip number 2. If your fabric has a large enough weave, you can actually spot the grain by eye. You can use the texture of the fabric as a guide for the warp and the weft and mark the grain accordingly. Tip number 3. If you have a selvage, use that as a guide and align your pieces perpendicular to it. I use a dressmaker's square ruler to ensure that the line I mark remains straight all the way across compared to the vertical edge of the selvage. Tip number 4. If you can't find the selvage, look for a long end of the fabric and assume that's the warp, and try using the tearing method. Cut a small snip in the side and carefully tear the fabric. The fabric will naturally want to tear along the grain following the weave of the fabric, giving you a nice straight line. You'll have a slightly wavy edge, but don't worry, that can be ironed flat again. Always make sure to test this method on a smaller piece of the same fabric, because some textiles won't tear. Tip number 5. If you have a finer weave fabric that definitely won't enjoy being torn, like suiting, you can actually remove a thread to find the cross grain easily. Make a small snip and isolate a single thread away from the rest of the weave. This thread is actually part of the cross grain. Tug on it gently and pull the thread away from the fabric. You'll get a little bit of gathering, but just keep pulling carefully until you've removed the thread. Now you have a neat line on the cross grain that you can cut along. And just for good measure, let's watch that satisfying pull again. Now that you've figured out where the grain on your fabric starts, let's work out the correct method of cutting your pattern. In all commercial dress patterns, you'll find particular symbols, like notches and the different guidelines to follow that correspond to different sizes. You'll also find a long arrow going across the pattern piece. This arrow is for the grain line, and it shows you where the pattern manufacturers have aligned the fabric for the best cut. Oftentimes they'll also include notes to accompany these symbols, like this one, which says to line the arrow on the straight grain. To use a pattern properly, you'll want to lay your pattern flat on the fabric, making sure your grain line is parallel to the straight edge. I use a ruler to make sure that the straight line of the grain arrow is evenly spaced from the edge of the fabric or from the grain line. Then you can pin away. Now if you don't have enough fabric, you can also use the weft or the horizontal grain to cut your patterns with. Keep in mind though, the cross grain is known to shrink a little bit more than the straight grain. Sometimes you'll come across a pattern piece without any grain lines. It's usually a safe bet to assume that if it has a straight edge, you can use that instead. Some pieces will have instructions to cut on the fold. This means that you need to align the straight edge against fabric that has been folded on the straight grain to cut a mirrored piece. But why is it important to follow the grain? Can't you just cut the fabric however you want without being so fussy? Technically, you can cut off grain if you want to. However, let's look at another important reason to cut on the grain. Fabrics have all types of beautiful textures, colours and patterns, but a lot of specialty fabrics also have specialty finishes. Your stock standard cotton and cotton drill looks the same way whichever way you move it. Patterned fabric like this printed striped cotton is a little easier to work with in terms of grain because you can easily line up the pattern to get it straight. Here's an example of the fabric pieces cut off grain. You can see that the stripes don't align on the seam, giving it a wonky and weird appearance. But what happens if your fabric doesn't have a pattern? And how does cutting off grain affect the final look? Here's an example of fabric without a pattern, but with an obvious sheen to show how cutting on a grain affects the final look. When cut on the grain, this lovely purple taffeta has a beautiful shine and shifts in the light. Can you see how, even when moved, the three separate panels all shift in colour in the same way? The three panels below are cut from the same taffeta, but as you can see by the arrows, the grain has been shifted so that all three panels are on a different grain. When you move the fabric, you can see that, unlike the first example, the shift in the sheen doesn't match. And if I were to hold a light to it, you can see that the way the fabric picks up the light in each panel is completely different. Let's go for a really obvious example and use two-tone silk taffeta. Also known as shot taffeta, the reason why this fabric is so lovely is because it's woven using two different colours to give it an iridescent shift. In the example of this fabric, the warp or the vertical grain is purple and the weft or the horizontal grain is blue. So depending on which way you move the fabric, it can either look one colour or the other. Now showing you the sample where the fabric is cut on all different grains, and you can see that not only does the fabric sheen pick up the light differently, but the colours look completely different as well. And this is why it's important to cut on a grain. Not only to make sure that your fabric doesn't stretch or warp or become shapeless over time, but to also ensure that the finish of the fabric stays cohesive throughout the whole garment. After all, if you've worked so hard on a project, would you not want the final outcome to look its best? Working with fabric can be challenging and confusing, and sometimes downright terrifying. Hopefully this rambling video has helped to make the science of fabric a little less perplexing and enjoyable in the long run, and also helped to share my love of fabric too. Thank you so much for watching this video. As I've stated at the beginning of this video, this will be the first of a series which will be covering a great deal of subjects. But if you're curious about a certain subject, please don't hesitate to leave a comment or a suggestion. Please don't forget to subscribe if you're interested in seeing more sewing tutorials, and you can also follow me on my socials listed below. As always, have an amazing day and stay crafty.